The sun was beginning to set when Mark ventured deeper into the heart of the national park. He had been hiking all day, the trail winding through thick trees and dense underbrush. The sounds of the forest surrounded him, the rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, the wind whispering through the branches. It was peaceful, almost soothing. But as he moved further into the woods, something started to feel off. At first it was subtle, a faint sound, barely audible, just on the edge of hearing, a whisper. Mark paused and strained his ears, trying to catch what it was saying, but all he could hear was the wind. He shook it off as his imagination running wild. After all, he had been hiking alone for hours, and the isolation was starting to get to him. But the whispers didn't stop. They came again, this time a little clearer. They were soft and unintelligible at first, like someone murmuring just out of reach. Mark's heart rate picked up slightly, but he convinced himself it was just the rustling of leaves, or perhaps a distant animal making strange noises. He kept walking, determined to push through. He had come to enjoy the quiet, the solitude, the opportunity to disconnect from the world. As night began to settle in, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just faint murmurs in the wind. Mark could almost make out words now, but they weren't in any language he recognized. They seemed to echo through the trees, a soft and eerie hum that tugged at the edges of his mind. He paused again, looking around. Nothing. Just trees and shadows stretching long into the night. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift around him. The whispering started to feel closer. Mark spun around quickly, but there was no one behind him. He was completely alone. He tried to laugh it off, telling himself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on his mind, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating. His instincts told him to move faster, to get out of the woods before it was too dark, but the whispers didn't stop. They followed him. And then, it happened. A sound that froze him in place. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Mark's breath caught in his throat, and he turned around again. This time, his eyes searched the trees for any sign of movement, any figure, anything. But the forest was empty. The footsteps were still. There, though, right behind him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he took another step forward, almost running now. His mind raced, but there was no time to process what was happening. He glanced behind him one last time, his pulse pounding in his ears. There was no one. But the footprints in the dirt, fresh, clear prints, were still there, right in front of him, as if someone had been walking just a step behind. And they were still moving forward. The woods had always been a place for adventure, a sanctuary for those looking to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. For Emily and her friends, this weekend was supposed to be a fun escape, a camping trip far from everything, deep in the heart of the forest. They had hiked for hours, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the isolation that would come to define their stay. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, they stumbled upon an old cabin. It was tucked away in a small clearing, almost hidden by the thick trees that surrounded it. The wooden structure was weathered, its roof sagging and the paint peeling off in large chunks. Despite its dilapidated state, the cabin exuded a strange charm, and the group, eager for shelter from the growing cold, decided to explore it. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the scent of mildew and rot. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and dust hung in the air, disturbed by their every movement. There were no signs of life, no furniture, no signs of previous inhabitants, only remnants of a forgotten time. But the place had an eerie quiet to it, a stillness that set Emily on edge. They unpacked their bags and made a fire in the small, cracked fireplace, settling in for the night. The isolation, however, felt different here, more suffocating than peaceful. As the hours passed, the wind howled outside, and the temperature in the cabin dropped. They gathered closer around the fire, the crackling wood the only sound breaking the silence. That was, until they began to hear it. Soft at first, a faint tapping coming from somewhere within the walls. Emily furrowed her brow, thinking it was just the wind or the old house settling. But then it came again, louder this time, a rhythmic knock, as though someone, or something, was knocking from the inside of the cabin. She looked around at her friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. They were too wrapped up in their conversation, laughing and joking. Emily's unease grew. She stood up and walked to the far corner, pressing her ear against the wall. But there was nothing. No sound, just silence. Yet as she returned to the group, the knocks came again, this time accompanied by a low, muffled whisper, like someone was speaking just beyond her hearing. Her heart began to race. She tried to brush it off, to convince herself it was just her imagination running wild, in the dark. But then the knocking came once more, louder and more insistent. She froze, staring at the door, and that's when it happened. Another knock. This one was from the front door. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly turned to her friends. They hadn't heard it. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she moved to the window, her body trembling slightly. She peeked out into the night, expecting to see nothing more than the darkened woods. But then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, she saw it. A figure standing motionless, staring at the cabin. Her hand flew to her mouth, trying to stifle the gasp. The figure didn't move. It just watched them, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Waiting for them. The day had started off like any other solo hike. Sarah had set out early, excited for the challenge of a difficult trail that promised sweeping views of the valley below. She was used to hiking alone, finding peace in the solitude of the wilderness. But as the hours wore on and the sun climbed higher, the trail began to grow less defined. The markers were scarce, and the path seemed to fade into thick underbrush. Sarah paused, her brow furrowed. She had been here before, or so she thought, but the landscape seemed unfamiliar now. The trees were different, their shadows stretching in strange directions. She glanced at her map, but the trail she had been following didn't match what was before her. She must have veered off track. A knot of worry tightened in her chest as the realization set in. She was lost. Sarah cursed under her breath and started retracing her steps, but the woods looked the same from every angle. The silence around her was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. It was then that she heard it, the faintest of sounds, something scraping against bark, too quiet to be anything natural. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The noise came again, this time louder. It was low, almost animalistic, a dragging sound, followed by something like a snarl. She quickly looked around, but the trees seemed unchanged. The forest stood still, yet a sense of unease washed over her. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. A sudden chill crept down her spine as she noticed a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from the shadows of the trees. They weren't the reflective eyes of an animal. These were far too bright, far too aware. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she slowly backed away, trying to make out any details in the dim light. But the eyes remained fixed on her, unmoving. Her mind raced as she stumbled backward, trying to steady herself. She couldn't make out anything more, a shape, a figure, nothing. But those eyes were unblinking, watching her every move. Panic began to rise in her chest as she turned and sprinted down the trail, pushing herself faster, her heart pounding in her ears. But she could feel it now, the presence behind her, the unmistakable feeling that something was following. She heard it then, the sound of something moving swiftly through the trees, keeping pace with her, though it made no sound. She glanced back, but the woods were empty. Still, the sensation of being pursued only grew stronger. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning as she dodged branches and rocks, her eyes scanning the woods for any sign of the trail. And then it happened. She tripped, her foot catching on a root, and she stumbled, crashing to the ground. For a split second, the world went silent. She lay there, gasping for air, her hands scraping at the earth beneath her. Slowly, she lifted her head, her eyes wide with fear. The figure was standing right in front of her now, tall, hunched, its glowing, eyes staring down at her, unmoving, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Oh, Minnie. The forest was supposed to be his sanctuary. Mark Westbrook, a survivalist expert with decades of experience in some of the world's most treacherous environments, knew these woods like the back of his hand. He had traversed remote mountains, navigated dense swamps, and braved freezing temperatures. But this time, something was different. Mark had set out on a solo expedition to document a remote part of the forest that had long been untouched by human activity. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a few days spent hiking through the wilderness, testing his limits. But when days passed without any word, his friends and colleagues began to worry. Mark had never been one to stay silent for long. Even in the harshest of conditions, a search party was quickly assembled, their goal to track him down and bring him back. The woods were thick, dense, with towering pines and tangled underbrush. As they ventured deeper, the trees seemed to grow darker, the air heavy with a strange stillness. They called his name, but the only response was the whisper of the wind through the branches. It wasn't until the second day of searching that they found something. A small camp, abandoned and in disarray. Mark's gear was scattered across the ground, his tent torn open as if something had ripped through it. There were no signs of him, nothing to suggest where he had gone, but there was something unsettling about the scene. Strange symbols had been carved into the trees surrounding the camp, intricate and jagged, as if warning of something nearby. The symbols were unfamiliar, even to the seasoned experts in the search party. They had seen nothing like them in their years of wilderness survival. The deeper they went into the forest, the more disturbed they became. Broken branches marked the path, as if something heavy had been dragged through the trees. And then, in a clearing, they found the marks of a struggle. A patch of dirt churned up, leaves scattered in a chaotic swirl. It was clear that Mark had fought something or someone, but there was no sign of him, only the remnants of a desperate escape. As the search party pushed on, the tension grew thicker with every step. The unease that had settled over them was almost palpable, the feeling that they were being watched. And then, just as they were about to give up for the day, they heard it. A voice. Mark's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling out for help. From somewhere ahead, they followed the sound, their hearts racing with hope. But when they reached the source, all they found was a tattered backpack, half buried in the dirt. No sign of Mark, no trace of where he had gone. Only the eerie marks in the ground, as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the haunting echo of his cries.